On August 28, 1944, the greatest military advance in modern history ground to a complete halt, not because of German resistance, not because of battlefield casualties, not because of strategic miscalculation, because of an empty gas tank. General George Patton's Third Army had just accomplished something unprecedented in warfare. His tanks had raced 400 miles across France in 30 days, liberating town after town, crushing German defenses that crumbled like wet paper. The Wehrmacht was in total disarray. German commanders were reporting that the road to the Rhine lay virtually undefended. Victory, genuine victory that could end the entire European war before Christmas, seemed days away. And then Patton's quartermasters delivered their report. Third Army had received 32,000 gallons of fuel that day. They needed 350,000 gallons. The shortfall was catastrophic. 3 days later, on August 31st, Third Army received no fuel at all. Zero. The most rapid armored advance in military history came to a dead stop between the Meuse and Moselle Rivers while German defenders scrambled to rebuild the very fortifications that had been completely unmanned just 1 week earlier. Most people know D-Day as June 6th, 1944. The beaches, the paratroopers, the incredible bravery of men storming into machine gun fire. What almost nobody realizes is that D-Day's greatest crisis came not during the landings themselves, but 3 months later, when the Allies' own success nearly became their undoing. The fuel shortage that paralyzed the Allied advance in late August 1944 remains one of the most controversial moments of the entire war. Generals blamed each other. Politicians pointed fingers across the Atlantic. Historians have argued for 80 years about whether different decisions could have ended the war 6 months earlier and saved hundreds of thousands of lives. To understand how this disaster unfolded, you need to grasp one number that changed everything about modern warfare. When British War Office planners sat down to calculate what the D-Day invasion force would need, they discovered something that would have seemed impossible to generals from any previous era. 60%. 60% of everything the Allied armies required by total weight was petroleum. Fuel, gasoline, not ammunition, not food, not medical supplies, fuel. This was a complete transformation from every war that came before. In World War I, armies moved on horses and rails, artillery was towed by animals, supply dumps were accessed by train. The internal combustion engine existed, but it hadn't yet consumed warfare itself. By 1944, everything had changed. In the first month after the Normandy landings, approximately 171,500 vehicles would land on French soil. Every single one of them drank gasoline at rates that would have bankrupted any previous military campaign in history. Consider what mechanized warfare actually consumed. A single Sherman tank required roughly 1 gallon of fuel for every mile it traveled on a good road. In combat conditions, with maneuvering, idling, and difficult terrain, consumption could be significantly higher. Now multiply that by thousands of tanks, thousands of trucks, thousands of jeeps, half-tracks, ambulances, command vehicles, and support equipment. By late August, Patton's Third Army alone was consuming between 350,000 and 400,000 gallons every single day. Combined, First Army and Third Army needed approximately 800,000 gallons daily during active operations. To put that in perspective, imagine filling an Olympic swimming pool with gasoline. That pool holds about 660,000 gallons. The American armies in France were draining more than one of those pools every day just to keep moving. The British War Office estimate of 60% wasn't pessimism, it was mathematical reality, and it created a problem that would haunt the entire campaign. The fuel problems actually started on D-Day itself, though almost no one remembers this part of the story. When the first waves hit Normandy's beaches on June 6th, fuel arrived in 5-gallon jerry cans. The jerry can was actually a German design that the Allies had wisely copied. Unlike the clunky American 10-gallon drums from World War I, which required a separate funnel and tool just to pour, the German jerry can had 3 handles, could be carried by 1 or 2 men, and stacked efficiently without shifting. It was elegant engineering, and within hours of the invasion, it created chaos. The key to beach logistics was the DUKW, an amphibious truck that soldiers pronounced duck. These vehicles shuttled cargo from supply ships anchored offshore to the beaches and inland dumps. On D-Day, naval officers kept supply ships 12 to 15 miles from shore to protect them from German artillery. That meant DUKWs had to make long, slow round trips through choppy channel waters. The problem was brutally simple. DUKWs ran out of fuel while still in the water. When their engines died, their pumps failed. When their pumps failed, water flooded in. And when water flooded in, they sank. These vehicles weren't being destroyed by German shells or mines. They were drowning because of empty fuel tanks, taking their cargo and sometimes their crews with them. The Army's solution to the DUKW crisis created a second disaster. The engineer brigades operating the beaches were overwhelmed with supplies and didn't want empty jerry cans cluttering their already chaotic dumps. So, 1st Army issued an order that empties should not be returned to the ships. This violated every principle of supply chain management. The standard procedure called for swapping empty containers for full ones, creating a continuous cycle of reusable cans. By ordering troops to keep or discard the empties, the Army broke its own system. The result was predictable but devastating. Soldiers found other uses for the cans. Some became makeshift cooking stoves known as Benghazi burners. Others were converted to water containers. Most were simply thrown away by troops who'd grown accustomed to American logistical abundance. When supplies seemed infinite, why would anyone carefully preserve an empty metal can? By October 1944, 3.5 million jerry cans were reported lost. 3.5 million. This wasn't enemy action. This was an army accidentally discarding the very containers it needed to move fuel forward. By June 18th, 12 days after the invasion, 1st Army estimated it had accumulated only 5 days' worth of fuel reserves. For an operation of this scale and risk, that was a dangerously thin margin. Yet the June crisis never became campaign-threatening. The advance through Normandy was far slower than planners had anticipated. The hedgerow country, the bocage, with its dense vegetation and natural defensive positions, turned every field into a potential ambush site. American forces measured their progress in hundreds of yards, not miles. This was terrible for the soldiers fighting through that green hell, but it had one silver lining. Slower movement meant lower fuel consumption. 1st Army's daily gasoline usage in July ran approximately 9,500 barrels, well below the planners' worst-case projections. Alternative supply methods also adapted quickly. After a devastating storm destroyed the American artificial harbor between June 19th and 22nd, landing ship tanks and other vessels took over the unloading burden. They actually exceeded the original planned discharge rates by mid-June. The small port of Port-en-Bessin was captured intact and began feeding fuel directly to forward depots, bypassing the chaotic beach system entirely. The June fuel crisis was real. It demonstrated serious planning gaps. It killed men and destroyed equipment, but it never threatened the success of D-Day itself. The real catastrophe was still 2 months away. Everything changed on July 25th, 1944. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy, shattered German defensive lines with a combination of massive aerial bombardment and concentrated armored assault. What had been a grinding, bloody crawl through hedgerow country transformed almost overnight into a race across open terrain. Patton's 3rd Army, officially activated on August 1st, exploded out of the Normandy pocket like a compressed spring suddenly released. His tanks swept through Brittany, then pivoted east toward Paris and beyond. Towns that had spent 4 years under German occupation were liberated in hours. German units that tried to stand and fight were encircled and destroyed. Those that retreated often couldn't move fast enough to escape. By late August, the Allies had achieved something that exceeded their most optimistic projections. They were weeks, possibly months, ahead of the schedule laid out in Operation Overlord's planning documents. And therein lay the disaster. The planning assumptions for Overlord had anticipated a methodical advance. Capture territory, consolidate, build up supplies, advance again. The timeline called for reaching the Seine River, which flows through Paris, on D+90. That would be early September. Instead, the Allies crossed the Seine by D+79. They were ahead of schedule. Spectacularly, impossibly ahead of schedule. The problem was that logistics couldn't keep pace with victory. Every mile the armies advanced added another mile to the supply line stretching back to Normandy. The beaches and ports that had seemed barely adequate for a measured advance were now trying to support forces operating over 400 miles away. The mathematics became inexorable. More distance meant more fuel consumed in delivery. More fuel consumed in delivery meant less fuel available at the front. Less fuel at the front meant the advance would slow. But the advance wasn't slowing, at least not yet, because commanders were pushing forward with whatever fuel they had, assuming more was coming. On August 25th, the same day Paris was liberated, American logisticians activated their emergency solution. They called it the Red Ball Express. The concept was simple in theory. Designate specific highways as one-way military routes. Run convoys of trucks 24 hours a day. Push supplies forward as fast as rubber and gasoline could carry them. At its peak, nearly 6,000 2.5-ton General Motors cargo trucks operated around the clock on the Red Ball routes. The drivers, over 75% of whom were African American soldiers serving in a still segregated army, pushed themselves and their vehicles to the breaking point. They delivered approximately 12,500 tons of supplies daily, an achievement that seemed to defy the limits of what trucks could accomplish. The Red Ball Express kept the advance alive through sheer determination and mechanical endurance. It delivered over 400,000 tons in just 83 days of operation. It also consumed 300,000 gallons of fuel every single day. Stop and consider that number. The system designed to deliver fuel to the front was itself consuming 300,000 gallons daily. Some logistics studies estimated that it required 5 gallons of fuel consumed to deliver 1 gallon of fuel to the fighting units. This created a vicious cycle that no amount of heroism could break. The more fuel you tried to deliver, the more fuel you consumed in the delivery. The farther the front lines advanced, the worse the ratio became. Every victory made the next victory harder to sustain. The Red Ball Express was performing miracles, but miracles have limits. Allied planners had actually foreseen this problem. Their solution was elegant in concept. Operation PLUTO, pipeline under the ocean, would pump fuel directly from England across the English Channel to forward areas in France. No trucks required. No jerry cans to lose. Just a continuous flow of petroleum through underwater pipes. 2 routes were planned. Bambi would run from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, a distance of 70 miles. Dumbo would connect Dungeness in Kent to Boulogne, only 30 miles. The pumping stations in England were capable of extraordinary volumes. The Isle of Wight facility could move 3,000 tons per day. Dungeness could handle 3,500 tons. On paper, PLUTO would solve everything. In reality, PLUTO failed precisely when it was needed most. Bambi deployment didn't begin until August 12th. It didn't become operational until September 22nd, nearly 4 months after D-Day, and almost a month after the critical fuel shortage. When it finally worked, it delivered a pathetic 3,300 long tons between September 22nd and October 4th, when the line was terminated due to poor performance. Dumbo, the more successful route, didn't become operational until October 26th. By then, the crisis had passed. The opportunity had been lost. The war would continue into 1945. Which brings us back to August 28th, 1944. Patton's Third Army quartermasters delivered their report that morning. They had received 32,000 gallons of gasoline. They needed 350,000 to 400,000 gallons to sustain operations. The shortfall, 368,000 gallons, was roughly equal to the entire daily fuel consumption of one armored division in active combat. August 29th was worse. Deliveries dropped further. On August 31st, 3rd Army received nothing, not a drop. The tanks that had raced across France faster than any armored force in history were now stationary, their crews waiting beside empty fuel tanks while the greatest opportunity of the war slipped away. Patton's reaction was volcanic. On August 29th, he drove personally to General Omar Bradley's headquarters and demanded fuel. Bradley, commanding all American ground forces in France, delivered the news that Patton must have dreaded. No appreciable amount of gasoline could be expected before September 3rd. The Third Army Diary recorded Patton's response with diplomatic understatement, calling it a small bit of anxiety for the time. Anyone who knew Patton understood what that phrase actually meant. The most aggressive combat commander in the American Army, a man who had driven his forces forward with relentless fury, who had outrun every timeline and exceeded every expectation, was now being told to sit and wait while his tanks gathered dust. What made this crisis different from the June problems wasn't just the shortage itself, it was the context in which it occurred. By late August, German forces west of the Rhine had been shattered. The Falaise pocket had closed, trapping 50,000 German troops. The Wehrmacht was retreating in complete disorder across France. Entire units had ceased to exist as fighting formations. Most critically, German defenses east of the Moselle River, the last major water barrier before Germany itself, were minimal and still forming. When Patton's reconnaissance units reached the Moselle on September 1st and 2nd, their reports were stunning. They found no enemy visible on the other side. Multiple good sites for bridges, all undefended. Rolling ground beyond the river, perfect tank country, waiting to be taken. The German forces defending the entire Lorraine region at that moment consisted of just 9 infantry battalions, 2 artillery batteries, and 10 tanks. The Siegfried Line, Germany's main defensive fortification system running along the frontier, was still largely unmanned. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt received urgent orders on September 1st to keep Patton out of Lorraine until German frontier defenses could be built up. The order itself was an admission of how thin those defenses actually were. At precisely this moment, with victory seemingly within grasp, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower faced the most controversial decision of his command. 2 of his subordinates were proposing radical solutions. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group in the north. He proposed a narrow front strategy, concentrate all available supplies, every drop of fuel, and every round of ammunition to his forces, launch a powerful thrust across Belgium toward the Ruhr industrial region and then Berlin. Montgomery promised that with all the resources of the Allied armies, he could end the war by Christmas 1944. Patton was proposing his own narrow front. Give him 400,000 gallons of fuel, he argued, and Third Army could be inside Germany in 2 days. Exploit the weak German defenses before they hardened. Win the war while the enemy was still reeling. Eisenhower rejected both proposals. Instead, Eisenhower ordered a broad front strategy, rather than concentrating everything on a single thrust. Whether Montgomery's in the north or Patton's in the center, Allied forces would advance across the entire line. Pin the Germans everywhere. Prevent them from concentrating their remaining forces for a counterattack against an exposed Allied spearhead. The logic was sound, at least on paper. A single concentrated thrust would have exposed flanks hundreds of miles long. German mobile reserves, even in their weakened state, excelled at exactly the kind of defensive counterattack that exposed flanks invited. The broad front was safer, more methodical, less likely to produce a dramatic reversal. To implement the strategy, Eisenhower made a fateful fuel allocation decision. Priority went to Montgomery's 21st Army Group in the north. This meant diverting fuel away from Patton to support what would become Operation Market Garden, Montgomery's ambitious attempt to capture bridges across the Rhine in the Netherlands. Third Army would receive reduced allocations. The advance that had already been halted by fuel shortage would now be officially constrained by strategic choice. The fuel allocation wasn't purely military. It was also political. Eisenhower commanded a coalition army. American and British forces had to work together, which meant American and British governments had to work together. Churchill wanted British forces to lead the final advance into Germany. Roosevelt needed to maintain the alliance. Eisenhower, as supreme commander, had to balance military opportunity against political necessity. By restricting Patton to prioritize Montgomery, Eisenhower was managing the complex relationship between 2 allied nations at war. The cost was operational opportunity. The benefit was keeping the alliance together. Patton's supporters saw this as a betrayal. They argued that American lives were being sacrificed on the altar of British pride, that a clear military opportunity was being squandered for political convenience. Eisenhower's defenders pointed out that without Allied unity, the entire war effort was at risk. A rupture between American and British commands could have consequences far beyond any single battle. The debate has never been resolved. On August 31st, 1944, Third Army came to a complete stop. The momentum that had carried Patton's tanks 400 miles in 30 days, the most rapid advance in modern military history up to that point, ended not with a battle, but with a whimper. Tanks sat idle. Infantry waited. Commanders stared at maps showing roads they couldn't travel and objectives they couldn't reach. Meanwhile, German commanders were using every hour of Allied inactivity. Reinforcements began moving toward the front. The Siegfried Line received its first meaningful garrisons. Defensive positions that had been completely abandoned were now being prepared for defense. The window was closing. What would have happened if Patton had received his fuel? This question has haunted military historians for 80 years. The arguments on both sides are compelling. Patton's advocates point to the intelligence reports from early September. German defenses were virtually non-existent. The Moselle crossings were unguarded. Patton's 4th Armored Division had already demonstrated what it could accomplish, advancing 450 miles while capturing 11,000 German prisoners. The Germans had only 5 functioning divisions opposing the entire American advance. With 400,000 gallons of fuel, Patton claimed he could penetrate German territory within 2 days. Given the state of German defenses at that moment, his claim wasn't unreasonable. The Siegfried Line existed as a fortification, but fortifications without defenders are just concrete obstacles. Those who defend Eisenhower's decision make equally powerful points. Even with 400,000 gallons, how far could Patton actually advance? The distance from the Moselle to the Rhine was still over 100 miles. Fuel consumption calculations suggest Third Army could sustain forward momentum for perhaps 100 to 150 miles maximum before running dry again, this time deep in enemy territory. The Siegfried Line, even unmanned, represented enormous engineering: concrete bunkers, anti-tank obstacles, minefields stretching for hundreds of miles. Breaking through would require not just fuel, but ammunition, engineers, and infantry support that were all equally constrained. German capacity to concentrate forces was actually superior to American logistics at that moment. While Patton advanced, German reserves were already moving forward. An exposed American spearhead, running low on fuel inside Germany, would have been vulnerable to exactly the kind of counterattack that German commanders excelled at executing. And without securing ports, any advance was ultimately futile. Antwerp, the massive Belgian port that could have solved the supply crisis, remained blocked by German forces until November 14th. Without port capacity closer to the front, even a victorious crossing of the Rhine would have left supply lines critically vulnerable. Perhaps the most telling evidence comes from the German perspective. In December 1944, German officers captured an American fuel depot during the Battle of the Bulge. What they found inside shocked them. The depot contained more fuel than their entire Panzer Corps had received in 6 months of fighting. One captured officer later reflected that seeing that depot clarified everything. The outcome of the war was already decided. Germany could not match American industrial production. Every gallon the Americans had was a gallon Germany could never produce. The only question was how long the dying would continue. This suggests something important. Even if Patton's thrust had succeeded in September, even if he had reached the Rhine or crossed it, Germany's defeat was certain. The fuel crisis might have extended the war by months. It might have cost thousands of additional lives, but it could not have changed the ultimate outcome. The war would end with German surrender. The only variable was the date. According to official Army historical records, by September 10, 1944, the period of critical fuel shortage had ended. Railheads began functioning as French rail lines were repaired. Supply levels became adequate for sustained operations. Third Army could resume offensive activities. The acute crisis lasted roughly 2 weeks. Yet those 2 weeks transformed the campaign. The window of German vulnerability had closed. Forces that had been completely demoralized in late August had time to recover. Commanders like von Rundstedt reorganized their shattered units. Reinforcements arrived. the Siegfried Line was manned. When the Allies resumed their advance, they faced a very different enemy. The war would continue through the brutal winter of 1944 to 45. The Battle of the Bulge still lay ahead. Tens of thousands more would die before Germany finally surrendered in May 1945. One of the least understood aspects of the August crisis was how the jerry can shortage from June came back to haunt the campaign. Remember those 3.5 million lost containers? By August, the consequences had become critical. Even when fuel was available in rear area depots in Normandy, the lack of containers to move it forward created bottlenecks. Fuel couldn't be pumped directly into vehicles at the front. It had to be transported in containers, and the containers had been scattered across France or converted to other uses or simply thrown away by troops who saw no value in preserving empty metal cans. The Army had equipment that could fill 720 jerry cans per hour, but that equipment was useless without empty cans to fill. At the critical moment in August, supply officers found themselves rationing containers as strictly as they rationed fuel itself. The June crisis had planted a time bomb that exploded 3 months later. The fuel crisis of August to September 1944 offers a profound lesson about the nature of military success. Victory can create its own defeat. The faster the Allies advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched. The more territory they liberated, the more resources were required to hold it. The greater their success, the harder it became to sustain. This was not a failure of planning exactly. The logistics officers knew the mathematics. They understood the consumption rates. They had warned that rapid advance would outpace supply. What they hadn't anticipated was how spectacularly successful the breakout would be. The planning assumptions for Overlord had been deliberately conservative, accounting for strong German resistance and methodical Allied progress. No one had planned for German collapse. When the collapse came, it created a situation that no logistics system could handle. The choice was between slowing the advance to match supply capacity, which would give the Germans time to recover, or pushing forward and accepting that the advance would eventually run out of fuel. The Allies chose to push forward, and then the fuel ran out. Did fuel almost stop D-Day? The honest answer is no, not in June. The jerrycan crisis and DUKW problems were real, but manageable. The beachhead held because German counterattack never materialized, not because fuel was suddenly abundant. What fuel almost stopped was the exploitation of D-Day's success. The Allied invasion of Normandy succeeded brilliantly. The breakout exceeded all expectations. The German army in the west was shattered. Victory, complete victory, seemed within reach. And then the tanks stopped moving. The 5-day halt in late August 1944 seemed brief at the time. In retrospect, it may have extended the war by 6 months. It allowed German defenses to reform. It gave the Wehrmacht time to prepare the counteroffensive that would become the Battle of the Bulge. It cost lives that might have been saved by a faster end to the conflict. Whether different decisions could have prevented this outcome, whether Eisenhower should have chosen Patton over Montgomery, whether a narrow thrust could have succeeded where the broad front did not, these questions will never be definitively answered. What we know is this: in late August 1944, the greatest military campaign in history came to a halt not because of enemy action, but because of an equation that no amount of heroism could change. The tanks needed fuel. The fuel wasn't there, and the window closed. The liberation of Europe would continue through a brutal winter and into the spring of 1945. Germany would finally surrender in May, 11 months after D-Day, 6 months after the fuel crisis suggested the war might have ended. Those extra months meant more battles, more casualties, more cities destroyed, more lives shattered, all because the greatest army in the world ran out of gas.